You have been warned. Do not draft these players in your fantasy draft because SI's fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano is calling them busts for 2021. And here with me to discuss who is on his bust list, SI senior fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano. Fabs, before we get to the players, let's talk about how you define what a bust is.
A bust is a player who you draft in the first 5 or 6 rounds, or you draft to play a prominent role on your team who doesn't live up to expectations or that draft position. So if you draft a second quarterback in the late rounds or a backup tight end in the late rounds and he falters, that's not a bust because the draft capital that you used wasn't valuable, right? So it's mostly the big name players who aren't going to live up to where they're drafted in 2021.
All right, so let's get into this list. Now, you have 2 running backs, 2 second-year running backs, and then also a wide receiver who found a new home in 2021. Why don't you tell us who's 3 of these players on your list here?
We'll start off with DAndre Swift. And Swift is a strange case, right? Because when we started talking about sleepers and that kind of thing a couple of months ago, well, he was a player who I thought could be a breakout. And now I'm concerned about him because Detroit brought in Jamal Williams. And remember, Anthony Lynn, the new offensive coordinator for the Lions, called Williams a classic A-back. What does that make DAndre Swift? I mean, I thought he was the classic A-back, right? They also brought in Todd Gurley for a visit. They didn't sign him, but the fact that they brought Gurley in for a visit concerns me. So DAndre Swift was going as high as the 2nd round a couple of weeks ago. Now he's more of a 3rd round pick. And to be quite honest with you, I'm concerned about the fact that maybe he's not going to be the featured player in that backfield. Maybe it's going to be a committee, and maybe Jamal Williams sees more of a role. And also, don't forget about the curse of Barry Sanders. Not one running back who the Lions have drafted since Sanders retired has really been a reliable fantasy option. You can find that information in my archive at si.com/Fabiano. I'm also going with James Robinson as the bust. This is kind of low-hanging fruit. He was the RB7 last season. He was tremendous, came out of nowhere, undrafted free agent. Jacksonville hit a home run. Well, now they draft Travis Etienne in the 1st round, and Etienne is picked by the new regime, including Urban Meyer. So this is going to end up being a committee situation, right? Robinson's not going to average nearly 20 touches a game like he did last year. Robinson's not going to average over 17 fantasy points per game like he did last season. And now we're kind of left scratching our heads figuring, well, who's going to be the number 1 back in this backfield and who's going to be 2? And don't forget, Carlos Hyde is also in the mix, and Urban Meyer knows Carlos Hyde well from their collegiate days. So this is suddenly a potentially confusing committee, and James Robinson can't be drafted in a prominent role. He would have been before the Jaguars did select Etienne out of Clemson. And then finally, Will Fuller. Now, Will Fuller was great last season. He put up over 17 points per game while being the number 1 wide receiver in Houston for Deshaun Watson. And as much as I love Tua Tagovailoa, I don't think he's on the level of Deshaun Watson. I mean, that's not even a question at this point. And Fuller's now going from Houston, where he was really the top wide receiver, to Miami, where you've got Jalen Waddle and Devontae Parker and Mike Gesicki. They drafted Hunter Long. Preston Williams is in the mix. Bill, you get what I'm talking about here, man. It's a very crowded group of wide receivers and tight ends in Miami. And let's also be honest. Before last year, Will Fuller had almost always been a mediocre or disappointing fantasy player, either because of a lack of production or because he was always hurt. So Will Fuller, who was a wide receiver 1 last year before he got suspended, can't be drafted as anything more than a wide receiver 3 or flex in 2021.
All right, that's quite the list of star players, or at least big name players, Fabs. That's why I love doing some of these fantasy analysis videos with you, because you're never just taking the cheap way out and naming a bunch of scrubs to begin with. These are star-powered players. Also on this list, you got David Montgomery, who was tremendous in 2020, and so was the Packers tight end Robert Tonyan. You can see the top 5 list of your bust for 2021. And if you want to read more analysis from Michael Fabiano when it comes to fantasy football, it's all up on Sports Illustrated. Go check it out, si.com/fantasy.